So yeah, thank you for making the choice to come here today and engage in something bigger than maybe your comfort and convenience. And we're also really grateful to the Virginia Humanities for supporting these community events in the Just Mercy project that this is a part of. I want to say a piece about Springhouse. So Springhouse has been organizing these events in connection to a class that I'm teaching on Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. Springhouse is a school for teens and adults, and we have a vision of a world where all life thrives. And we know to get there, we're going to need to look at where thriving is absent. And America's jails and prisons and the criminal justice system more broadly, certainly one of those places. So like Brian Stevenson tells us in Just Mercy, in a lesson that he learns from his grandmother, who would wrap him up in a tight embrace, to understand important things, you have to get close. So before we propose changes or solutions or even presume we know the issues, we've got to get proximate. Springhouse practices and shares the source design principles. Take care of vulnerability, cultivate personhood, build beloved community, learn from the earth, and love and serve others. So those things thread through everything we do. And in Brian Stevenson, we see an example of someone who's really dedicated his life to taking care of vulnerability. He says a culture shouldn't be judged by its achievements in art and technology and design, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. The poor, the destitute, the incarcerated. So in Just Mercy, while national issues are certainly discussed, many of the particulars are located in the state of Alabama. So we're really grateful to have someone here today who can speak to issues a little closer to home for us in Southwest Virginia on how these national challenges show up more locally. Brandy Faulkner is the Gloria D. Smith Professor of Black Studies at Virginia Tech and a collegiate assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, where she's been involved in different capacities for more than a decade. Her teaching and research focus on race and public policy and U.S. constitutional law, and she teaches a wide variety of courses in these areas. One example of the creativity she brings into her work is Team Yellow, a video game that she designed to help people understand power, how to build power, and think about successful political and social change. Brandy is a multi-award winning teacher, inspiring students to exceed their own expectations for learning, intellectual development, and personal growth. And since her arrival at Virginia Tech, she's worked to promote an appreciation of diversity, inclusiveness, and collaboration, both on their campus and in the wider New River Valley. As a scholar, activist, and organizer, she works with both institutions and individuals engaged in advocacy, community leadership, and public policy development. Her passion is for helping grassroots and social change-based organizations find success in their endeavors, and she's committed to being a resource within her communities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brandy Faulkner. Do you want to use this mic, or do you want to just...
I would prefer not to,
Great.
but
I think
if
that'll
I
be
need
fine.
to, I certainly will. And please don't hesitate to let me know if you can't hear me and I need to use the microphone. So I definitely want to say good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for taking time out to come today and listen to a little bit of Virginia's history, and what I hope will be both some time for reflection, but also some encouragement. And I'm so grateful to Mr. Wolf for the invitation to be here and to talk with you about Virginia's place in this broader conversation about civil rights and what justice looks like, what engagement looks like. And I was so incredibly satisfied to hear that he was teaching just mercy. I fear we don't have enough of that kind of deep thinking for students, opportunities to wrestle with some really difficult things. Right? And surely no one can read it or watch it and not be incredibly moved, I think, by that particular situation. I know that I was. I definitely was. But I think maybe more than anything, it shows us how determination and strong will and a general concern for humanity, I think, can be so powerful, even in some very dire situations. How we can change the course of history when we really start working together to move some things forward. And I think it also helps us understand that we can identify faults. We can be okay with imperfection. We can interrogate what goes on around us and come out the other side of it better people and a better society. Takes a whole lot of courage to do that. A lot of courage to work through harm and to work through trauma and to figure things out. But we can do it. Right? Virginia has such a rich history, and I've always thought it to be such a shame that when we study things like the civil rights movement, right, this international movement that pretty much everyone knows at least something about, can maybe name at least a few people associated with it, but when we study it, it tends to be in the context of Montgomery, Alabama, or Selma, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, where King writes his famous letter from jail. We talk about Memphis, Tennessee. We talk about Little Rock, Arkansas. We talk about Albany, Georgia, Greensboro, North Carolina, and certainly all of those places and the incredible people associated with them. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Rosa Parks, Jesse Jackson, all of them undoubtedly phenomenal people. But we had some pretty amazing things going on right here in Virginia as well. And I just think it's odd that usually not even so much as a footnote in the discussion of civil rights, but there were plenty of people fighting across our state for justice during that time, before that time, and since that time. And so what I thought I might do as we think about the context of how Walter Macmillan's life changed in Just Mercy, we could maybe think about who some of the faces were in Virginia, who was trying hard to forged the way forward in many areas of civil rights, not just in criminal justice, though that is certainly important. And so what I've done is I've chosen 6 people who I think represent the kind of work that was going on at that time and some of the work that has also continued. And maybe it can lead you on your own exploration. Hopefully you will have heard of some of these folks, and if not, take an opportunity to check them out, see what they were up to, see what kinds of brilliant things they were doing right here. Now, of course, for time's sake, I'm going to be very brief in this part because I also want to talk about some of the progress that we've made, especially in regard to criminal justice. But the first 3 that I'll start with, Barbara Johns, Charles Sherrod, and Lawrence Campbell. So let's do a show of hands here. Who's heard of Barbara Johns? Okay, good. You'll learn something. Yes, this is great. This is great. This is what education is about, right? Anybody heard of Charles Sherrod? Okay. Lawrence Campbell? All right, very, very good. Well, let's start with Barbara Johns. She is one of my favorite people to study in terms of Virginia's civil rights history. Incredible leader. An incredible leader. She grew up just a few hours from here out in Prince Edward County. If you're familiar with Farmville, right, it's in that county. And she was a transplant. She was actually born in New York, but then quickly migrated here to where she had family roots. And went to school here. And she became a junior in high school when she started to notice that things just weren't right educationally. She was in a segregated black school. Now, this is 1951. And things were pretty bad. They had a wood stove, so the children were practically freezing to death in winter. Textbooks were falling apart. You had to handle them with special care, or you'd lose all your pages. Facilities were a mess. They had no resources. But she was astute enough to notice that the nearby schools that were designated whites only had plenty of resources. They were doing fine. And the students there were better prepared to learn because of it. And she wondered what she had done to deserve that situation. What had other people who looked like her done to deserve that situation? And as she began to really understand what happens with systemic racism, she gradually started to figure out they hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't their fault. That there were powerful people and powerful systems who had already made these decisions for her and for people who looked like her. Well, she wasn't going to stand for that. Now, mind you, she was 16 years old. 16. And she started putting together a plan to have a school walkout. She got into a little bit of trouble. She tricked the school principal and the teachers by forging his name on a memo that called for a mass assembly in the auditorium. And so the teachers, believing this memo to be real, sent all the students into the auditorium, but they weren't allowed in because the memo said so. Well, she got up in front of 400 students at the school. Now, mind you, the capacity of the school was capped at 281 students. So what do you suspect the classrooms look like with 400 students? Right? She got before these 400 students and she said, here is the situation. There is inequality right here in our schools. And it's not fair. And we need to do something about it. So what I want everybody to do is walk out and not come back until they build us a new school. And they walked out. Well, it didn't take long before people started talking about what was going on, and some attorneys from the NAACP's nearby chapters heard about what was happening down in Prince Edward County, and they came to help. They filed a lawsuit against the school board. And they began to fight, not for a better black school. They fought for an end to segregated schools in Virginia. And this case, along with 4 others, became consolidated and known as Brown versus the Board of Education. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 would hear this case and rule that separate but equal schools are illegal. It was because of Virginia's Barbara Johns, a 16-year-old student, that we got that case. The missing pages of history. Right? Landmark decision started right here in our state. Now, as you might imagine, the retaliation was pretty severe. The Ku Klux Klan burned crosses in her family's yard, and her parents became terrified. They promptly put her on a bus to Alabama to live with relatives because they were scared of what was going to happen to her. And she never returned to Virginia. She spent time in Alabama, later moved up to Philadelphia, started a family, and lived out her life as an activist, as someone seeking justice. Right? So that's Barbara Johns. We do now have in Richmond a memorial to her and to other students, right, who were the backbone of the school desegregation movement. Right? So we should never forget her name. Second here is Charles Sherrod. Now, he was one of the founders and a leader in a very important organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When we think about SNCC and what they did, now they were a group of college students and their mentors and advisors who launched sit-ins in public facilities. You might be familiar with the Greensboro-Woolsworth sit-ins, for example, where they simply would show up, sit there until they got arrested, hauled off, or assaulted, whichever came first. Right? But they started staging these sit-ins and demonstrations all around the country, and some of the most important ones happened right here in Virginia, mostly in the metro areas like Richmond. Charles Sherrod was one of the leaders of the student sit-ins, and he went to many stores, hotels, and restaurants. And he was a student at Virginia University when he started actively engaging in these sit-ins. He fought against discrimination in public transportation, in public facilities, and he believed that if we were going to be successful with making at least some progress, that everybody in the community had to come together. And so he went out and he talked to people. He went out to find allies in the white community and among other races, and he said, look, this benefits all of us. We're not asking you for something special or unique. We are simply requiring everyone to treat us like human beings. He followed a no-bail policy. Now, this was very popular among these SNCC activists, and what it means is that when you get arrested, and you're definitely going to get arrested, right, for violating the laws, you refuse to post bail. Whatever time you're given, that is the time you serve. No one can come get you out. Why do you think they chose to do that? Anybody? Why would that be important? Yeah. Fill up the jails, right? You see these on all of these people in the jails on the news, right? And people start to gain a little bit of sympathy. At least that's the hope, right? Right? At least that's the hope, that people start to ask questions. Why are all of those folks over there in jail just for trying to eat at a restaurant? Right? And it makes people wrestle with the moral aspect of discrimination. Right?
It's harder to sweep under the rug.
Yes, much harder to sweep under the rug. Yeah. But think about the discipline that takes, right? I think it's safe to say that a lot of people, they want to get out of jail as soon as possible, right? These were people who said, no, I'll sit here. I'll serve every day of my time for doing what's right. And he was one of the people who instituted and started this no bail policy in SNCC, right here in Virginia. He, after college, moved down to Georgia, where he continued to work for equality. But the legacy that he left right here in Virginia, in Richmond and Surry County, has been invaluable. An entire generation of leaders in that area that came under the direction of Charles Sherrod. It's fascinating and definitely somebody we should know. Third here is Lawrence Campbell, and he began his work down in Danville, again, just a couple hours from here, and he was a member of the NAACP chapter in Danville. His work began down at the public library. Now, how often are we encouraged as children to read, to explore, to check out books, to open our minds to the world of possibilities that come through reading? He wanted to do that, except he wasn't allowed in the library, nor was anyone who looked like him. In some instances, he could go to one and they would let him come in, but he could only stay in a small section of the library and couldn't have any contact with anybody white because of Jim Crowism and segregation. He wanted to check out books and take them home, be able to read them, but he couldn't. And so he launched a protest to end segregation at public libraries. He was successful. He was successful. Because of him, that happened. And he went on to become very active in other parts of the civil rights movement, primarily with voting rights. He did a whole lot of voter registration, on the upward of 4,000 people that he personally registered in Danville and Pittsylvania County. That's extraordinary. That's a lot of people to support in that way. Okay? So really, really phenomenal folks. The last three, Cora Tucker, South Boston, Herbert Colton, Petersburg, and Lester Banks of Lunenburg County. Anybody heard of any one of these? Okay, great. I'm so happy to know that you can learn something here. Cora Tucker was a fireball. She grew up in South Boston, Virginia, about 3.5 hours from here, to our southeast. And she was known as a really strong leader down in Halifax County. She brought together so many people during the civil rights movement in South Boston, Halifax, Lynchburg, Clarksville, that entire area there, to fight against things like discrimination in employment, desegregation of schools. But aside from her work on those mainstream civil rights issues, she became known for one that at that time most people weren't talking about, and that's environmental justice. Okay? Environmental justice was just coming onto the public's radar in regard to people of color during that time, largely because of a movement that was stirring down in Warren County, North Carolina, where very, very dangerous chemicals, PCBs, that would later become banned by the EPA, were just dumped in black and brown communities, right? Making them sick, people getting cancer, being born with birth defects because of these toxins that were dumped there. Well, down in Halifax County, there was a proposal to clear some land for a nuclear waste disposal. Now, everybody knew that this thing was going to be a disaster. Okay? And think about it. Do you want a toxic nuclear waste disposal right outside your door? I don't think anybody wants that. But what was happening was that companies were targeting very, very poor, mostly black and brown communities for these dump sites. Why? Because it was easy. It's a disempowered community. Who's going to speak up? And even if they do, who's going to care? That was the thinking. All of this is well documented in EPA reports. They specifically said, this is why we're choosing the sites. Well, they picked the wrong one because Cora Tucker didn't stand for it. Right? She got together with other activists in Halifax County, and they began to fight this proposal for a nuclear waste disposal site in Halifax. And they fought, and they fought, and they fought for almost 2 years, and they won. They won. She went on to become the first black woman to run for governor in Virginia. Right? Unsuccessfully, right? But she ran. Something no one had done before. And so it is because of her work in environmental justice that we now have a large, sustainable environmental justice movement in underrepresented communities. Lots and lots and lots of work still to be done. People of color are still overrepresented near toxic sites. They suffer the most harm when it comes to air quality and lack of clean water. But because of Cora Tucker's work, many people now are aware of the disparities and are actively fighting against them. So she was remarkable. Herbert Colton, another person we should know. He grew up in Petersburg. And he became a very prolific activist during the civil rights movement. He actually worked with Martin Luther King. And this was in the organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay. Very, very popular organization at that time. And King was one of the founders and leaders of it. King often referred to Herbert as indispensable to the civil rights movement. And this was because he was mostly a teacher and a trainer, right? All across Virginia he traveled, and even to some of the more southern states, I should say, to train activists and how to be effective in change. He went to Virginia State University, served in the Army. Former Virginia Governor Doug Wilder eventually appointed him to the Virginia Council on Civil Rights, where he did so much incredible work on race and poverty. A lot of the groundwork and infrastructure for fighting poverty, racialized poverty specifically, is because of Herbert Colton. And then finally, Lester Banks. In the 1940s, he became the leader of the statewide Virginia NAACP. And he was involved with that organization for more than 30 years. Pretty incredible. During his tenure, the NAACP filed more lawsuits to end housing discrimination, school segregation, employment discrimination, as well as criminal justice reform under him. He was attacked many times, beaten up many times for casually strolling into places that were labeled whites only and helping himself to whatever he would like to do. He thought that was the only way to win. You gotta fight to win, right? And he was never afraid to do that. He went on to become a school principal down in Halifax County and also Charles City, Virginia. Fought so hard against injustices in the public schools and in the communities in general. And he was one of the leaders in starting to think about this idea of incarceration and how it affected communities. Okay. So he is also very, very important. So these are just a few of the names of people who have made an extraordinary difference right here in our state, right? Whose names we just don't hear. Right? So issues related to incarceration and criminal justice have long been a concern for the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders. And it is primarily because the criminal justice system became the primary legal way to keep black people in their place after slavery. Right? Now, there were other ways, right? Outright lynchings and murders and intimidation. But if you wanted to do it the legal way, you did it through the criminal justice system. For example, states like Virginia passed vagrancy laws. Right? And that allowed black people to be arrested and forced into state labor if they didn't have jobs. Black people could routinely be arrested for crimes that they didn't commit, given sham trials, incarcerated, executed without any due process. So I wish I could conclude that Walter Macmillan's story is rare, that it's exceptional in some way, that the horrific things that we saw in Just Mercy were isolated, that they just don't happen that often, but the truth is they do. And our criminal justice system right here in Virginia is in dire need of restructuring. When we look at some of the data that comes out of the National Registry on Exonerations, this is a project that was started out at the University of California, Irvine, and they track people who are exonerated all over the country for crimes that they didn't commit. They have found that black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a murder. 7 times. That is unreal. 3.5 times more likely to be wrongfully charged and convicted of an assault. 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of drug-related offenses. These are extraordinary rates for a community that is just about 13% of the population. When we're getting it that wrong, that often, it lets us know there is a deep systemic problem going on. Just within the past 5 years in Virginia, 19 people have been released from prison, exonerated for very serious crimes that they never committed. Now keep something in mind. These are just the people who prevailed. These were the ones who actually had attorneys who were willing to stick by them and keep fighting for them. My heart breaks to think about how many more there are still incarcerated, still suffering, along with their families. Many giving up because they see no way out. In other words, Walter McMillan was lucky to have Bryan Stevenson, a young and ambitious attorney who committed to fighting for justice. There aren't enough Bryan Stevensons to do the work that needs to be done. And so, the wrongfully convicted sit in prison, innocent, afraid, rightfully angry, wondering, how is this even possible? Virginia has had a lot of Walter McMillans, and I just want to point out a few of them. Again, just in the interest of time, I want to talk about 2 who have been exonerated and 1 who hasn't gotten that lucky yet. So, lest we conclude that everything works out nice and neatly in the end, it doesn't. So the first person I want to mention is Joseph Carter. Just to check, anybody heard of him? No? Okay, good. Well, in 1989, Juan Reyes was murdered over in Norfolk, Virginia. And his murder was investigated by a detective named Robert Glenn Ford. Okay. Appeared to be a routine homicide investigation, but Ford had a reputation for being relentless in his investigations, and most people admired that, right? When politicians and public servants declared that they are tough on crime, people kind of like that. It makes us feel maybe just a little bit safer. Maybe makes us feel like maybe justice will be served when someone is a victim of a crime. But the problem wasn't that Ford was tough on crime, as he liked to say. The problem was that he was corrupt. For over a decade, he took bribes from drug dealers who paid him to look the other way, paid him to give favorable recommendations to the judge when they had to go before the courts. And he also used a whole lot of unethical tactics to coerce confessions from people, innocent people who were being investigated for crimes. And that's what happened to Joseph Carter. He paid fake witnesses to identify innocent people and to make false statements about their involvement in crimes. Now, there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever, physical or otherwise, that Carter was involved in Reyes's murder. Yet, Ford arrested him for that murder. And Joseph Carter spent 27 years in prison, always claiming his innocence. And it wasn't until attorneys with the Virginia Innocence Project got involved that information about Detective Ford started coming out. Even after someone else confessed to the murder, he remained in prison. Well, it was uncovering Ford's corruption that really helped here. He had actually been responsible for the wrong convictions of 5 other people that we know of. The FBI launched an investigation into him. And there was finally enough evidence to formally charge him with extortion, with conspiracy, and with corruption, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He only served 10 of them. So ironic. He went to prison and got out before the people he had helped to wrongfully put there. Meanwhile, people like Joseph Carter sat in prison. He was finally exonerated in 2021. 27 years. Imagine it. Can you imagine it? I honestly can't. I can try. I have tried. I cannot imagine what it is like to sit in prison for 27 years for something you did not do. Lamar Barnes. Everything changed for him the night he got arrested for murder and malicious wounding over in Portsmouth. He was accused of killing Amy McRae and also shooting and wounding Mark King and Adam Gregory and Christopher Hopkins over at King's home. There was apparently some drug-related altercation at King's home, and there were 2 perpetrators there who attacked McRae and attacked King and the other 2. Now, the question was, who was it? Okay. Well, there were so many different stories, but Barnes had an alibi. Okay. He was, in fact, hanging out with friends at an apartment complex. Okay. And so you really have to do some brain work here, right? Maybe it's just me. Somebody has an alibi. People who said, no, he was actually right here with me at the time that crime was occurring. It couldn't have been him. Yet he is arrested and charged. There was no physical evidence, of course, tying him to this murder because he wasn't there. But you have to understand how things usually happen, especially when you're dealing with people who have been in the system before. Right? And that's what was happening here. 3 witnesses at the home where this occurred described one of the perpetrators and then described the second perpetrator. The first perpetrator, 2 of them actually knew. Okay? And so they named this perpetrator, but could only give a description of the second one. They said he was very tall, and he was thin, and he had short, flat hair. Right? Lamar is a big dude. He's short, and he had locks. Nothing flat about that. But there was something deeper going on here. So Mark King, who had been shot during the altercation, had some short-term memory loss. And as he regained his memory, police went to see him. Hey, do you remember anything? Tell us what you know. We found marijuana at your place. And so if you don't tell us everything you know, we're going to throw the book at you. Well, they stuck a book in front of him, a photo lineup it's called. Said, hey, look at these pictures. Pick out the person who did it. And King pointed to Barnes. Barnes immediately denied any involvement when he was arrested. Throughout the whole interrogation, he told police, no, actually, here's where I was and I can prove it. Eyewitnesses had identified a man by the name of Michael Artis as one of the attackers, and as the man who actually shot and killed McRae. And Artis turned himself in. He insisted that he had not shot McRae, that he had only been part of the attack. He hadn't killed anybody. And as the prosecutor started putting pressure on him, he too identified Barnes as the other perpetrator. And there were other eyewitnesses, all of whom were facing possession charges for marijuana. And miraculously, they all said Barnes was the other perpetrator. Now, what's going on here? Well, prosecutors have a whole lot of power. The power to enter into plea agreements is one of them. Prosecutor by the name of Almedia Fields arranged the deals for the eyewitnesses. She said, nobody will be charged with possession. All you have to do is go to court and tell the same story. 2 of them did just that. One of them said Barnes had been there, but he had left before the shooting. One of them said Barnes had never been there at all. Well, after the trial, I guess it started to weigh on the 2 who had said Barnes was there, and they recanted. One of whom was Artis. He recanted his testimony, stating that he had been pressured by the prosecutor to name Barnes as his accomplice, but he wasn't. Right? And he eventually gave the name of the person who was his accomplice. He said that the prosecutor told him that he would be facing life in prison for a marijuana possession charge if he didn't name Barnes. Now, despite this recanting, Barnes was still convicted. He was sentenced to life plus 28 years. All of his appeals failed. And it wasn't until 2018 when the Innocence Project Virginia, again, often emerging the heroes in these exoneration cases, they stepped in. And in its investigation, they concluded that Barnes's constitutional rights had been violated, that nobody was listening to and taking seriously his alibi, and that he was in fact innocent. Right? And he was exonerated in 2022, given a full and absolute pardon by Governor Northam. But again, look at how long he was in prison. It's extraordinary. Okay. Last one here. Arshawn Hicks. In 1999, 3 men robbed the Open House Diner over in Norfolk. And there was an off-duty police officer inside, a woman by the name of Lisa Bailey, who tried to stop the robbery, but she was shot and killed. Police tracked the robbers to a house not too far away and found a gun and some money and some shoes and clothes that people had described being on the person who shot her. Well, they found them in a room that was shared by 2 people, Larry Roscoe and Arshawn Hicks. And Arshawn was arrested and charged with robbery and murder. He was 16 years old. Okay. Police questioned him without his parents there, and he did not have an attorney present either. And after hours of questioning and physical beatings, he confessed. He was tried as an adult, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. After he went to prison, he recanted his confession, saying that he had been beaten and coerced by the detectives into confessing. Okay. He said that he was at the diner, but he had not taken any money and that he certainly hadn't killed anyone. But nobody believed him. Well, in 2006, Larry Roscoe confessed to the murder and the shooting. But it was kept secret. The prosecutors did not turn over that confession and evidence to the defense attorney for Arshawn Hicks. Roscoe made a sworn affidavit and a recorded confession saying that the gun, the clothes, the shoes, all of it, they were his, and that Arshawn had nothing to do with it. Now, at that time, Virginia had a law that basically said you are entitled to evidence as a criminal defendant for a period of 1 year. Okay. After that, too late, so sorry, you don't get it. So Arshawn's time period had run out. Okay. Now, this law has since changed in Virginia, but he could not use the new law because it wasn't retroactive. And so what happened? What happened is that Arshawn is still in prison. The Innocence Project is working really hard to free him. He's now 40 years old. These are just 3 examples of some of the kinds of problems that we saw with Walter McMillan and Just Mercy. They happened right here in Virginia. Don't think that this is an Alabama thing or Mississippi thing. No, it's going on here. How many more are there? I don't know. No one does. And I think that's the really scary part. Now, these 3 that I just talked about are black men because that tends to be the targeted demographic. But they certainly aren't the only ones. There are plenty of white people who are victimized in the exact same way. What do they have in common? They're usually poor, dispossessed, right? Often too afraid to speak up. And so they're convicted, or they enter into plea agreements that send them to prison for the rest of their lives. So where are we now in all of this? I want to conclude with some hope because all is not lost. Okay, thanks to organizations who have been fighting these kinds of things across Virginia, organizations like Virginia Organizing, the NAACP, the Equal Justice Initiative, Justice Forward, all of these kinds of organizations have worked their behinds off to change the circumstances and to make people more aware that these kinds of things do happen with some frequency. And they're figuring out through their work how to be effective. Right? Progress has been slow, no doubt about it. Woefully slow, unacceptably slow. But it does happen. So here are just a few recent bills that I'll summarize for you that are helping in the criminal justice system. SB 1266, which took effect in 2021, it ends presumption against bail. Now this is so interesting. We often hear, right, that in our criminal justice system there's a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Well, it didn't work that way in Virginia until 2021 when it came to bail. So normally, under a presumption of innocence, it is the prosecutor who has to show that the criminal defendant is a danger to the community or is a flight risk. And if a judge determines that that is true, then bail will not be granted. Right? But in Virginia, the burden falls on the criminal defendant. They have to prove they're not a flight risk or that they're not a threat to the community. Well, what does that mean practically? It practically means that bail will usually not be granted in capital cases and in most other criminal cases unless there is some negotiated deal with the prosecutor's office. Well, SB 1266, I am happy to say, fixed it. And now there is presumption of innocence in bail. Isn't that great? It's great. It's remarkable. We can celebrate it. SB 1165 abolished the death penalty in Virginia. This has been a long time battle. So much debate over the death penalty in Virginia. Many who support it and say, look, it ensures justice. And it means that the people who have committed these crimes won't be able to do it again. Others say no. When we look at the rates of wrongful convictions, to know that people are being executed and they're innocent should scare us all. But there has been this back and forth in Virginia as sort of a battleground state for this topic. Incidentally, most people, when we talk about the sheer number of executions, we immediately think about Texas, right? Because we're told that they're the worst of the worst of the worst. Virginia's number one. With 1,390 executions, Virginia has executed more people than any other state in the country. It is not Texas. And what makes it even more atrocious in Virginia are the racial disparities. For example, in Virginia, the black population is slightly under 20%. It's about 19.8% at this point. Black people make up 78% of death penalty convictions and executions. Astonishing. 19% of a population making up 78% of the death penalty cases? It's amazing. Well, in 2021, Virginia became the first southern state to abolish the death penalty. SB 5007, it ends the jury penalty. What's a jury penalty? Virginia was one of only 2 states that had a jury penalty. What that meant was that if you were a criminal defendant and you chose to have a trial by jury instead of a trial by judge, you also had to accept whatever sentence the jury gave you, as opposed to the sentence a judge would give you. Why does that matter? Judges are bound legally by sentencing guidelines that are written by the state legislature. Juries are not. So juries tend to be far harsher, give longer sentences than judges. Okay. Well, SB 5007 ended that practice. A person can now competently choose a jury trial and still be sentenced by a judge who is bound by sentencing guidelines. SB 1406 limited decriminalization of marijuana possession. What this bill did basically was to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana for personal use. It's not a sweeping bill. It's not a bill with a whole lot of reach. But it does mean that because Virginia had such high numbers of incarceration, particularly based on race and the possession of marijuana, it will help to stop those charges and convictions. And then finally, HB 2038, the mass supervision reform. Now, most people are familiar with mass incarceration, right? The practice of sending people into jails for minor offenses, particularly drug-related offenses. But fewer people talk about mass supervision. The millions of people who are trapped in the criminal justice system long after they've served their sentences. Okay? They fall under the control of parole boards and parole officers, probation officers. And those folks have the authority to send them back to prison for even the most minor infractions. So let's say you have served 3 years in prison for stealing food from a grocery store. And then you get a conditional release. Right? But you have to check in with the parole officer every week. And let's say you're working 2 jobs, trying to get back on your feet after being incarcerated, which is very common for formerly incarcerated folks. And you oversleep and you miss your check-in. That parole officer can send you right back to prison for years. HB 2038 ended that. It placed a cap on supervision time, which is now 1 year for misdemeanors, a maximum of 5 years for felonies. It's going to help. It's going to help a whole lot. Okay? So these are just some of the things that we can look forward to, that we can point to and say, it can be done. All is not lost, right? When people really work and come together and say, this is important to our community, we can get it done. So I wanted to leave with just some questions, and I'm over my time. Can we take just maybe 10 minutes to do these? Okay, good. Maybe have a discussion with the person next to you or with 2 people next to you. Just some questions to think through. What is your idea of a beloved community? Right? This idea is often associated with Martin Luther King, who had such visionary prowess, right? To think about what communities should look like. Well, what's your vision for a successful, thriving community? Are there any justice-related issues that you're passionate about? What are some of the ways that we can promote healing after a community crisis? Think about people who have been wrongfully convicted. They're coming back into the community. If you think for 1 minute, you just say, oh, glad you're out, things are so much better for you now, and it's going to turn out great? No. That's not how it works. Right? And in Virginia, you have to jump through so many hoops to even get any compensation for the wrongful conviction. How should we respond to or meet the needs of formerly incarcerated persons who are returning to our communities? Just some questions to think through. But maybe talk to a partner for a few minutes about this, and then I'd be very interested in hearing what some of you come up with. All right? Just about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. Absolutely.